Hello and welcome to News Centre. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The Supreme Court has struck down the third extension in tenure given to S.K. Mishra, the head of the Enforcement Directorate. It has termed it illegal and has ordered Mishra to relinquish office by the 31st of July. Remember, the Apex Court had struck down an extension given to Mishra in 2021, but the government had promulgated an ordinance to nullify the order. Ashwin Kumar is here with the details on what transpired in the court.
Well, the Supreme Court clearly has said that while the centre does indeed have the power to go ahead and to grant such extensions for a 5-year term, it has held that as far as this specific case is concerned of S.K. Mishra, it is invalid in law, and towards that end had asked S.K. Mishra to demit office by July 31st. The rationale of the Apex Court being that India will be undergoing an evaluation by the FATF, and so to ensure that there's a smooth transition of power, the Supreme Court has granted that small leeway of allowing S.K. Mishra to end his term on July 31st. Now, here's the background to it of it all. S.K. Mishra was appointed in 2018 for a 2-year term. Subsequently, 3 times, 2020, 2021 and 2022, government had granted him a 1-year extension. This was the third extension that he's currently operating on. In the midst of it all, in 2021, the Supreme Court had held that S.K. Mishra cannot be allowed any further extensions. That, in turn, had been nullified by an ordinance, and therefore we had this litigation before the Apex Court. So on the question of the ordinance and the power and the changes that were made to the law, well, the Supreme Court said that that's kosher, that's good, that's fine. The centre does indeed have the power to grant this extension, but with respect to S.K. Mishra, the Supreme Court noted that any such move that will nullify the Apex Court order, that will nullify the mandamus that was granted by the Apex Court when it had explicitly said that this S.K. Mishra cannot be allowed to continue as the ED director, that cannot be permitted, that is not good in law, and that is invalid in law. So the Apex Court asking for S.K. Mishra to demit office July 31st should be his last date in the office.
All right, thanks Ashwin for joining us. We're now joined by senior lawyer H.P. Ranina. Mr. Ranina, thank you for joining us. Now, the Supreme Court has made it clear that the extensions given to the ED director on the 17th of November 2021 and 17th of November 2022 were illegal. Now, all the decisions that have been taken since 17th November 2021, could they be up for questioning? Can a person affected by ED's orders during the period of S.K. Mishra's tenure go to the Supreme Court, seek relief?
I don't think that is possible. And even if somebody goes, I don't think the Supreme Court will grant relief, because he has taken certain action based on a law which was passed by the ordinance. Now that law has been struck down, that cannot have any retrospective effect. Secondly, the Supreme Court itself has permitted him to continue until 31st of July. And therefore, there is some sanctity given to that past appointment. So no action can be challenged. And I don't think the Supreme Court will ever challenge an action which has already been taken, because that would create chaos in the legal profession and in the law as such. So it's not going to happen that way.
Right. I would also like to ask you that when the Supreme Court had decided against the extension given to S.K. Mishra, there was an ordinance brought by the government. Later on, there was a law passed in Parliament where the government could extend the tenure of the ED director by 1 year up to a period of 5 years. Does that law remain unaffected at all? Can that now apply to future ED directors?
Well, we have to read the judgment. I don't know what exactly is mentioned in the judgment of the Supreme Court. But normally, I think in this particular case, since the Supreme Court had struck down his earlier extension, they felt that the executive was trying to trample upon the area of the judicial review. And in view of the separation of powers guaranteed by the Constitution of India, you cannot do that. Now, as far as the law is concerned, the law itself has not been struck down. It is the extension which has been struck down. So I think the law will remain, and in future possibly they can give extension for 5 years. So in the case of S.K. Mishra, it's a very special case in view of the fact that the Supreme Court had already given its view that his extension was invalid in law. But the government tried to overrule that and tried to nullify the Supreme Court's order. That is something which has been struck down, because that is unconstitutional. Supreme Court, executive, and parliament are separate organs of the state, and each one has to respect its own grounds and cannot tread on the other.
Right. So, Mr. Raina, is it fair to understand that this particular judgment of the Supreme Court was limited to S.K. Mishra's case? It will not have a precedent, nor bearing on other ED directors appointed in future and any extension that the government wants to give to them?
That's what I believe, but I think we need to read the judgment. We need to read the fine print of the judgment and see exactly what it says. But as things stand, and what has been mentioned by your correspondent, it appears that it's in the specific case of S.K. Mishra that they have struck it down and said that you cannot overrule the Supreme Court's earlier order. But for the sake of convenience, he has been allowed to continue until 31st of July.
Right. And finally, Mr. Raina, what will this mean for the separation of powers and future actions by government when it comes to extensions given to other important officials, other important heads of department? Because the Supreme Court made an important point saying transgression of constitutional limitations and intrusion into judicial power by legislature is violative of principles of separation of powers. What will be the impact of this judgment in future cases and government functioning in future, especially in appointments?
As far as future is concerned, one has to see whether the law which has been already passed by Parliament is constitutionally valid or not. I don't think that act has been challenged in the Supreme Court. And therefore, if the act has not been challenged in the Supreme Court, then that law will continue and will prevail. Because legislature also has its own right to pass such legislation as it deems fit. Therefore, the Supreme Court may not interfere in future. That's my view of the matter as I read, as I understand what has happened in today's decision. But as I said, we have to read the fine print and exactly come to the conclusion what has been stated. But the separation of powers is
And
a
one more
fundamental
question.
principle of the Constitution and is a basic structure of the Constitution which cannot be changed.
Right. One important point that the Supreme Court, while concluding and allowing the extension to go on till the 31st of July, the court acknowledged that, yes, there is an FATF review that is going on right now, and we want a smooth transition in public interest. The government needs to be given some time. How important is this period for the Enforcement Directorate, for the Government of India, with this FATF review that is ongoing?
Well, it's difficult for me to comment on that, how relevant, because another 20 days are what remain till 31st of July. To what extent this is appropriate, I cannot comment on it. But possibly if the government feels that it is not adequate, they may make an application to the Supreme Court once again and ask for further time, maybe another 15 days or another month. But on what basis they have come to this decision, I cannot comment because they feel that 20 days is enough. If the Supreme Court thinks 20 days is enough, well, so be it. And if the government feels otherwise, they can always make an application and ask for further time be given.
All right. Mr. Raina, thank you so much for joining us with your perspective on this important judgment with regard to the extension of the ED director. Moving on.